The dog stopped at the frozen lake and refused to turn back. Across the ice, a relief truck sat abandoned in the snow. Inside, there was blood, torn blankets, and no driver. Beyond the pines, a wounded woman was clutching the list of people the town had erased. The winter shelter was locked while its own people were freezing in silence. One veteran followed his dog and forced a beautiful town to face its ugliest secret. Thank God some signs are quiet enough to miss, but strong enough to save a life. Where are you watching from? Like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep telling stories about people who should never be forgotten. Winter made Ashen Pike look kinder than it was. From the porch of his cabin, Elias Vance could see the whole northern edge of the lake shining under the morning sun, hard and white and beautiful enough to fool anyone passing through. Pine trees stood along the far shore with snow gathered on their branches. Thin smoke lifted from chimneys in town. The roofs looked soft, the roads looked clean. Even the silence had a polished quality, as if the cold had frozen every ugly thing beneath the surface. Elias knew better. Cold did not hate you. That was what made it dangerous. It simply waited until you stopped respecting it. He stood at the foot of his porch steps, fastening the cuff of one brown leather glove, while Sable moved ahead of him through the powder. The German shepherd's black and brown coat caught the pale light, her dark back almost blue against the snow. She wore her old leather collar, the scratched metal tag at her throat tapping softly with each step. Stay. The word was worn but still readable. Elias had given her that tag years ago, after she learned the command better than some men learned loyalty. Stay with the injured, stay with the frightened, stay when leaving would be easier. Most mornings, Sable took the narrow path east along the tree line. She liked the places where deer crossed and where wind pushed scents low beneath the branches. But that morning she stopped before the path began. Her ears lifted. Elias looked up. What is it? Sable didn't look at him. She faced the frozen lake. And the surface stretched wide and bright between his cabin and the far woods. Last night's storm had left a fresh layer of snow across it, smooth except where the wind had combed it into pale ridges. A temporary ice road cut across the lake farther north, used by locals who knew where the ice was thick enough and where it was not. Sable stepped toward it. No, Elias said, calm but firm. She stopped, but only for a second. Then she gave a low whine and looked back at him. That sound reached him deeper than a bark would have. Sable barked at strangers, raccoons, and occasionally at the mail truck when it offended her sense of order, but she whined only when something living had shifted wrong in the world. Elias followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing but white, then his eyes adjusted. And near the start of the ice road, half covered by drifting snow, were tire marks, not clean tracks. These swerved, corrected, then dragged sideways toward the far bank. Beside them were footprints, adult, uneven, one stride long, the next short, then a smear where a boot had slipped. Elias felt the morning narrow around him. He had spent 5 years trying not to read ground the way he used to, trying not to turn broken branches, scattered snow, and interrupted silence into a story of injury and urgency. After leaving the service, he had told himself that Ashen Pike needed a man who fixed boats, cleared roofs, and kept to himself. Not a man who saw emergencies before anyone else wanted to name them. Sable took 3 steps onto the ice. Elias exhaled through his nose. You're going to make me regret breakfast, aren't you? Her tail moved once, low and brief. He went back inside for his field pack. By the time they crossed the first 100 yards, the sun had risen higher, making the lake almost painfully bright. Elias moved carefully, testing each step, listening for the dull report of stressed ice beneath snow. Sable stayed ahead, but not far, pausing whenever he slowed. She was not frantic. That worried him more. Panic wasted motion. Sable was measuring hers. Halfway across, Elias noticed something caught on a low pine at the far bank. A torn strip of orange fabric, snapping faintly in the wind. Rescue orange. He pulled it free and rubbed the material between his fingers. Not old, not weathered, torn hard recently. Sable had already moved on. And the truck appeared beyond a rise near the opposite shore, angled nose first into a bank of snow. It was a winter relief vehicle, white under road grime, with a faded emblem on the door. Its rear doors hung open. Cardboard boxes lay scattered in the snow. Blankets, thermal socks, sealed packets of medicine, canned food rolling loose near the tire. Elias approached the cab. The passenger side window was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. A steel thermos lay broken on the floor mat, its dark coffee frozen into a thin stain. On the outer door handle, blood had dried in a narrow smear. Not much. Enough. He checked the driver's seat. Empty. No body, no phone in sight, no purse, no obvious sign of a clean escape. He took out his own phone and called the local dispatch line. And it rang twice, then cut, then rang again through static. Ashen Pike Dispatch. This is Elias Vance, North Lake Road. I found a relief truck off the ice road near the West Timberline. Signs of injury. Possible missing driver. The woman on the line cursed softly, then covered the receiver too late. Road units are blocked south of Miller's Bend. Storm took down a power line and 2 trucks are stuck behind it. We can notify county, but it'll be a few hours. A few hours might be too many. I understand, Mr. Vance, but... Sable whined from the trees. Elias turned. She stood at the edge of the woods, one paw lifted, eyes fixed on a narrow break between the pines. I'll call back when I know more, he said, and ended the call. Dull. For a moment he stayed beside the truck, staring at the blood on the handle. There had been a time when hesitation was a luxury he did not have. Then came the years after, when he made hesitation into a home. Don't ask, don't step in, don't become the man people call when the worst has already happened. His thumb brushed the face of his old military watch. The glass was scratched across the numbers. He saw, for half a second, another winter. Another list. A man marked low priority because someone with a clipboard had decided age and distance mattered more than breath. Sable barked once. Elias closed his hand. All right, he said. We go. The trail into the woods was difficult to see unless you knew what pain looked like in snow. A heel dragging. A knee dropping once. And a handprint against the bark of a pine. The person had tried to keep moving after leaving the truck, then slowed as the trees thickened. Sable did not rush. Every few yards she stopped, looked back, and waited. Not for permission, for partnership. They found the woman in a shallow hollow beneath the pines. She sat against the base of a tree, one leg bent wrong beneath her, lips pale with cold. Her brown hair had come loose from a low tie, strands frozen near her cheek. She wore an orange winter relief jacket torn at one sleeve, and both arms wrapped around a cracked plastic document pouch pressed tight to her chest. When Elias stepped into view, her eyes opened. They were dark, alert, and afraid in a way that had nothing to do with being lost. It's all right, Elias said, keeping his hands visible. My name is Elias. I found your truck. The woman tried to push herself back and winced hard. Sable stopped beside Elias, then lowered herself into the snow. The woman looked from the dog to Elias's dark olive camouflage jacket, his brown tactical boots, the old discipline in how he stood. Her voice came out rough. If Walter Keene sent you, I don't have anything left to give him. Elias did not know who Walter Keene was to her in that moment. He knew only that she had not asked for help because she was not sure help was safe. No one sent me, he said. She did. He nodded toward Sable. The woman's eyes shifted to the shepherd. For the first time, something in her face loosened, not trust exactly, but a small failure of fear. Oh, what's your name? Elias asked. Mara, she said after a pause. Mara Bellamy. Can you stand, Mara? I drove off the road, that's all. That's not what I asked. Her jaw tightened, then the strength went out of it. No. Elias crouched, careful not to crowd her. I'm going to get you warm. Then we'll talk. She clutched the document pouch harder. Don't take this. I won't. They'll say I stole it. I won't. Only then did she let him check her leg. Getting Mara back across the lake took time. Elias used a folded emergency tarp from his pack as a drag sled for the worst stretches, then half-carried her where the snow grew too deep. She drifted in and out of focus but fought sleep with a stubbornness he respected. Twice she tried to speak. As twice the cold stole the words before they formed. Near the cabin she finally managed. The truck didn't slide. Elias kept moving. Save your breath. A pickup forced me off. I had blankets, medicine, food. Her head tipped against his shoulder, but her hand still held the pouch. They were waiting for me. For who? For the people at the old storage shed. Sable walked close beside them, her body angled toward Mara, as if the wind itself might try to take her. Inside the cabin, Elias laid Mara on the couch near the stove and called Dr. Helen Ward. The retired emergency physician lived 3 miles down the road and answered like a woman who had been expecting trouble all winter. "How bad?" she asked. "Leg injury, cold exposure. All conscious but fading. I'm coming." Helen arrived 20 minutes later in a dark blue parka, silver hair flattened under a wool cap, medical bag already open before she fully stepped through the door. She didn't waste words. She checked Mara's pupils, pulse, ankle, breathing, then glanced at Elias. "She's lucky," Helen said. "A few more hours outside and this would be a different conversation." Mara opened her eyes. "I can't go to the hospital yet." Helen snorted. "People who say that usually need one." "Please." Mara turned her face toward Elias. "Harbor House isn't broken. The heat works. They locked it." Elias stood near the window, watching the lake glow under the afternoon light. "Who locked it?" he asked. Mara swallowed, pain and anger moving together in her expression. For the resort," she whispered. "They're clearing the land for the lakefront resort, and there are people still out there, Elias. Adults, workers, old neighbors, people nobody checks on because nobody wants to admit they were left behind." Sable had settled beside the couch. Mara's hand hung over the edge, trembling slightly. The shepherd lifted her head and rested her muzzle beneath Mara's fingers. Mara did not pull away this time. Across the lake, Ashen Pike looked peaceful beneath the snow, all clean rooftops and pale smoke and winter light. For years, Elias had believed quiet meant no one was calling for him. Now he wondered how many voices a beautiful town could bury before the silence started to look like peace. By morning, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold had not loosened its grip on Ashen Pike. It pressed against the windows of Elias's cabin in pale sheets of frost. Outside, the lake shone too brightly beneath the sun, as if nothing had happened on its surface the day before. The relief truck was still out there somewhere beyond the western bank, half buried in snow, waiting for men with tow cables and official forms to decide what kind of accident it was supposed to be. Inside the cabin, Mara Bellamy sat on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders and one leg propped on a wooden crate. Her orange rescue jacket hung near the stove, torn sleeve drying stiffly in the heat. She looked smaller without it, not weak exactly, but less armored. And Helen Ward stood over her with a thermometer in one hand and an expression that tolerated no argument. "You need a hospital," Helen said. Mara looked at the floor. "I need 2 hours." "You have 1, unless your fever climbs." Elias stood by the sink, pouring coffee he had forgotten to drink. He had been awake most of the night, not because of the cold or the storm damage, or the official calls he knew would come later. It was the phrase Mara had whispered before finally sleeping. They locked it. A shelter did not simply lock itself in January, not in northern Minnesota, not when the lake froze hard enough to carry trucks and the wind could turn a bad decision into a body before dawn. As Sable lay near the couch, not touching Mara now, but close enough that the woman could reach her if she needed to. The shepherd's eyes followed every movement in the room. Mara noticed. She always watched people like that? "Only the ones trying too hard not to fall apart," Elias said. For the first time since he had found her, Mara almost smiled. It did not last. She reached for the cracked plastic document pouch on the table. Her fingers shook when she pulled it into her lap. "Harbor House started after the winter of '94, she said. "Before your time here." Elias sat across from her. "There was a man named Albie Crane," Mara continued. 68. Used to drive lumber before his knees gave out. And one night his truck wouldn't start, and every room in town was full because of a snowmobile race. They found him in the cab the next morning. Helen's face changed, not dramatically, but enough to show she remembered the story. People said it would never happen again. "So the church opened its basement first," Mara said. "Then the town raised money, built Harbor House on the West Road, beds, stove, emergency pantry, oil tank, a little medical room, nothing fancy. But if someone had nowhere warm to go, they went there." "And Walter Keene ran the fund," Elias said. Mara's mouth tightened at the name. Walter became the fund. She opened the pouch and spread several folded pages across the coffee table. They were not the kind of documents that looked evil at first glance. That was what made them worse. Printed columns, names, dates, boxes checked in black ink, notes written in the smooth, careful language of people who knew how to avoid blame. Every winter, Walter stood in front of the church and gave the speech, Mara said. About mercy, about neighbors, about how Ashen Pike takes care of its own. People believed him because they wanted to. I believed him. She tapped one sheet. This year he told us Harbor House had to close for safety inspection, heating system failure, carbon monoxide risk. He said everyone on the active list would be moved to a temporary shelter in Braddock Falls. Were they? Elias asked. Some were. That answer settled into the room harder than a simple no. Mara turned another page. Enough to make it look clean, and enough that if anyone asked, there were records. A van went out, 3 people were transferred, 2 signed intake forms, 1 got put in a motel for a night. Helen leaned closer. And the rest? Mara pointed to a column near the right side of the page. Low priority relocation. The words were small, ordinary, almost polite. Elias stared at them longer than he meant to. For a moment, the cabin went away. He was back in a colder place, years earlier, watching a civilian coordinator run a gloved finger down a clipboard while people waited near a damaged road. Priority 1, Priority 2, medical evacuation, transport deferred, not enough vehicles, not enough time. Someone old enough to have gray in his beard had looked at Elias as if rank or conscience could change the ink. And by the time they returned, the man was covered in snow. Sable lifted her head. Elias realized his hand had moved to the scratched face of his watch. Mara saw it. She did not ask. I signed one of the transfer confirmations, she said quietly. Helen looked at her. I didn't know, Mara said, and the words came out with more anger than defense. Walter said the second van had already taken them. He said the paperwork was delayed because the Braddock office was overwhelmed. He asked me to sign as transport witness because I'd loaded the supplies. I thought I was helping. And then? Elias asked. Then Ruth Calder came into the relief office looking for Jonah Reed. I said he hadn't shown up for breakfast in 3 days. Mara rubbed her thumb over the edge of the plastic pouch until it bent white. Jonah never misses coffee at Ruth's unless he can't breathe well enough to walk. Elias knew the name, but he didn't speak yet. I checked the transfer list, Mara said. Jonah was marked moved, but Ruth said he hadn't gone anywhere. So I checked 3 more names. Same thing. No family contacts, no permanent address, no one likely to ask the right questions quickly. Helen swore under her breath. Mara gathered the pages as if someone might burst through the door and take them. I went to Deputy Colin Arlen first. Elias knew Colin by sight. And a broad-shouldered sheriff's deputy with tired eyes and the habit of touching his radio whenever conversation grew uncomfortable. Not cruel. Not brave either. He said it sounded like a civil issue, Mara said. Charity board, property management, church records. He told me to bring it up at the next council meeting. In this weather? Helen said. Mara nodded. Then I emailed the council. Walter responded before anyone else, said I was under strain, said relief work in winter makes people see patterns where there's only confusion. Elias looked at the papers. And the paper? Runs on advertising from the Resort Development Group now. Mara gave a bitter laugh. They said they needed stronger proof before accusing Ashen Pike's most generous man of anything. The phrase most generous man stayed in the cabin like smoke. An hour later, Elias drove to the church. He left Mara with Helen under protest and took Sable with him. The roads into town had been plowed into narrow white corridors. Ashen Pike looked awake now, shop windows lit, men shoveling roofs, exhaust rising from idling trucks. People waved at Elias because small towns did that even when they did not know what to say to a man. The church stood near the square, white steeple sharp against the blue winter sky. Inside, it smelled of old wood, candle wax, and wet wool. Reverend Clara Holt was alone near the bulletin board, taking down last week's notices with slow, careful hands. As she was a slender woman in a long gray coat, silver blonde hair tucked behind one ear, her face lined less by age than by years of listening to grief without always knowing what to do with it. When she saw Elias, she did not look surprised. Mara's alive? Clara asked. For now. The answer hurt her. He saw it. I heard there was an accident, she said. It wasn't an accident. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Sable moved past Elias toward the bulletin board. Photographs covered it. Walter Keene smiling beside stacked blankets, Walter cutting a ribbon outside Harbor House, Walter standing beneath a banner that read, Ashen Pike takes care of its own. His camel coat looked warm even in pictures. His silver snowflake pin caught light in almost every frame. As Sable sat in front of the photographs, she did not growl, she did not bare her teeth, she only looked. Clara noticed and turned away first. "Reverend," Elias said, "if Harbor House moved everyone to Braddock Falls, where's the receiving list?" Clara folded a notice in half, then in half again. "The board has records. I'm asking if you've seen them." Her hand stopped. Outside, a truck passed slowly, chains clicking against packed snow. "I was told the details were being handled," Clara said. "By Walter. He has managed the fund for 20 years. That wasn't an answer. For a moment, Clara looked older. "I heard there were complications. A few people refused transport. A few chose private arrangements. Did you speak to them?" "No." The word cost her something. Elias waited. Clara's voice dropped. "I wanted to believe him." That was the first honest thing anyone had said about Walter Keene. When Elias returned to the cabin, Mara was awake, pale but steadier. Helen had spread the documents across the kitchen table and now stood over them with a doctor's fury, quiet, precise, and dangerous. "These aren't mistakes," Helen said. "This is triage language used by people who don't have the courage to admit they're making moral decisions." Mara reached for one page and turned it toward Elias. "Jonah Reed," she said. His name appeared near the bottom. "Age 53. Chronic pulmonary condition. No immediate family contact. Transport deferred. Low priority relocation." Elias felt the room tighten around him. And years ago, not long after he had moved to Ashen Pike, Jonah had fixed the cracked ribs of Elias's first fishing boat and refused payment. Elias had tried to insist. Jonah had only laughed, a rough sound full of sawdust and cigarette history, and said, "A new man in town ought to have somebody not counting the cost." Now that same man had been counted and placed at the bottom. Mara's voice shook. "If he's still in that storage shed tonight, I don't know if his lungs will make it." Elias looked down at Sable. The shepherd was standing now, quiet and ready, her amber eyes fixed on him. For years he had told himself that staying out of other people's business was a kind of peace. But peace, he was beginning to understand, could be another word for distance. And he picked up the page with Jonah's name and folded it once. "Then we don't wait for tonight," he said. They left before the sun reached its highest point. Elias did not like taking Mara back into the cold. Her face still held the pale, tight look of someone whose body had not forgiven yesterday. Dr. Helen had wrapped her injured leg, given her something for pain, and argued with her for nearly 10 minutes beside the stove. "You can point to a map," Helen said. "That is what maps are for." Mara pulled on her torn orange relief jacket with one arm. "A map won't tell you which fence gap isn't buried. A map won't know where the old logging road breaks off, and a map didn't sign the wrong paper." That ended the argument more effectively than anger would have. Elias watched her fasten the jacket with stiff fingers. He understood guilt when it dressed itself as duty. He had worn enough of it to recognize the weight. They avoided the main road. Mara said the resort people had cameras near the marked property line, and Elias believed her. The lakefront development had appeared in town slowly at first, as survey stakes, polite notices, and glossy renderings taped inside shop windows. Then came Dorian Pike, the project manager who spoke at council meetings with expensive calm. Mara described him as a man who never raised his voice because he had learned that paper could threaten louder than shouting. So Elias took them through the pines. Sable moved ahead, black and brown body sliding between trees with quiet purpose. Helen followed with her medical bag strapped across her shoulder, muttering about stubborn patients and men who enabled them. Amara walked between Elias and the doctor, leaning on a hiking pole Elias had cut down to fit her height. Every few steps, pain tightened her mouth, but she did not ask to stop. After half a mile, she said, "Jonah used to be the strongest man at the mill." Elias glanced at her. "Before my time, mostly," Mara continued. "But people still tell the story. Roof collapsed under wet snow. 2 men trapped under a beam. Jonah went back in after everyone else thought the place would come down." "I heard about it," Elias said. "He pulled them out, broke 3 ribs doing it. Town gave him a plaque." Mara's breath shook, partly from cold, partly from effort. "They bring it out every anniversary, same speech, same applause. Then last week somebody marked him low priority. The words didn't need more. They found the storage shed where the pines thickened near the old survey line. It was larger than Elias expected, a long wooden structure once used for road salt and equipment, now leaning slightly under its snow-loaded roof. Orange flags marked the ground beyond it. Beyond those, the lakefront resort land began. No smoke came from the bent stovepipe. That worried him. Mara pushed forward faster than she should have. "Jonah?" Elias caught the door and forced it open against packed snow. The smell inside was old wood, damp wool, kerosene, and people trying not to be afraid. 8 adults sat or stood around a small oil heater that had burned so low its flame was more suggestion than fire. The blankets covered shoulders. Cardboard had been laid over gaps in the wall where wind came through. A gray-haired couple sat close together on an overturned crate. 2 women in heavy coats shared a dented thermos. A man with red, swollen hands looked up from a half-repaired lantern. Nobody rushed the door. Nobody cried out. They had been waiting too long for that. Then a man near the back lifted his head. Jonah Reed was thinner than Elias remembered. His beard had gone mostly gray, and his cheeks had hollowed beneath eyes still sharp enough to recognize a debt. He wore a brown work coat that looked older than the shed, and one hand rested over his chest as if holding his lungs in place. "Well," Jonah rasped, "if it isn't the boat soldier." Elias stepped inside. "You still fixing things that should have been scrapped?" Jonah tried to laugh. The laugh became a cough so deep it bent him forward. Helen moved before anyone could ask. She crossed the shed, knelt in front of him, and opened her medical bag with a snap. "Don't talk." Jonah wiped his mouth with the back of one hand. Doctors always start with impossible orders. "And stubborn men always mistake dying for dignity," Helen said. That made one of the women near the heater give a small, tired smile. Mara stood just inside the doorway, looking at the faces in the shed. Her hand tightened around the walking pole. These were not names now, not columns, not relocation categories. They were knees under thin blankets, cracked lips, worn boots, coughs being swallowed so others would not worry. I'm sorry," she said. No one answered immediately. A woman with a lined face and a motel cleaner's badge still pinned to her coat looked away. The old man on the crate stared at the floor. Jonah watched Mara for a long moment. "You came back," he said finally. Mara swallowed. "Too late." Late and back are not the same thing. The sentence struck Elias harder than Jonah could have known. Sable went to Jonah then, not bounding, not sniffing wildly, not searching for anything hidden. She simply crossed the floorboards and sat beside his bad knee. Jonah looked down at her with a kind of embarrassment, as if being comforted was more difficult than being cold. "No need for that," he muttered. Sable lowered her head and rested her muzzle on his leg. Jonah's hand hovered above her ears. And it shook once before settling into her thick fur. His face folded inward, not from weakness, but from the sudden cruelty of gentleness, when a man has spent too long pretending he needs none. "I had a dog once," he whispered. "Wouldn't let me leave for work if the weather was bad." "What was his name?" Elias asked quietly. Jonah took a breath that caught halfway. "Bishop." For a few seconds, the shed was silent except for the heater clicking and the wind pressing at the walls. Then Jonah rubbed Sable's head and nodded toward the far corner. "Under that loose board," he said, "behind the broken snowshoes. I put some papers there when Pike's boys cleared Harbor House. Figured if they were throwing things away, maybe something in the trash still mattered." Elias pried up the board. The folder beneath was damp at one edge, but readable. Old Harbor House intake records, copies of winter shelter agreements, names, dates, signatures, a few newer pages with notes in neat block print, image-sensitive zone, transport deferred, no family contact, unsuitable for public-facing relocation. No one had written kill them, no one ever did. Elias felt the old cold move through him again, but this time it didn't freeze him in place, it sharpened him. "We're leaving," he said. The man with swollen hands looked toward the door. "To where?" "Harbor House." One of the women gave a bitter sound. "It's locked." "Then we unlock it." Mara looked at him. Helen did too. Jonah's hand remained on Sable's head. Before anyone could answer, tires crunched outside. Not one vehicle, 2. A Sable stood, body still, ears forward. The door opened without a knock. Dorian Pike entered like a man stepping into a meeting he had scheduled. He wore a dark wool overcoat, polished boots unsuited for the shed, and a blue scarf tucked neatly at his throat. Behind him came two security men in black parkas, their eyes moving over the room as if counting items in storage. "Mara," Dorian said with professional disappointment. "You've made this much worse than it needed to be." Elias put the folder inside his jacket. Dorian noticed, but his smile did not change. "And you must be Mr. Vance. I was told you prefer to stay out of town matters." "I'm learning." "These people are on restricted property," Dorian said. "The structure is unsafe. And if you move them without authorization and someone is injured, liability becomes very complicated." Helen stood. "They are already injured. Cold exposure, respiratory distress, inadequate heat. That complicated enough for you?" Dorian's eyes flicked to her medical bag, then away. "Dr. Ward, I respect your concern, but this is a property and safety matter." "No," Jonah said. The word was weak, but everyone heard it. He pushed himself up. Helen reached to stop him, but he shook his head. Sable stayed pressed against his leg as he stood. "This was never your property to hide us on," Jonah said, "and we're not trespassing. We're sheltering where your people left us after locking the place built to keep us alive." Dorian's pleasant expression thinned. "Mr. Verdies, Reed, you are confused." Jonah coughed once, hard. "I'm cold, not confused." Another vehicle pulled up outside. This time the man who stepped in did not look like he belonged to Dorian. Deputy Colin Arlen filled the doorway in a brown winter sheriff's coat, snow on his shoulders, one hand resting uncertainly near the radio clipped to his chest. His broad face tightened when he saw the room. Mara went still. "You came." Colin did not meet her eyes at first. "Walter asked me to check on a disturbance." Dorian turned. "Deputy, excellent. These individuals are unlawfully occupying—" "Stop," Colin said. The word surprised him as much as it surprised everyone else. He looked at Jonah, at the gray-haired couple, at the heater burning low, at Helen's open medical bag, at Mara's bandaged leg. And then he looked at Elias. For a long moment, Colin seemed to search for the safest sentence and failed to find one. Finally, he pulled a small black notebook from his coat pocket. "I need names," he said, voice rough. "All of them. And I need to know how long you've been here." Dorian's face hardened. "Deputy, I would advise—" "I said I need names." The shed changed then. Not loudly. No one cheered. No one embraced. But something shifted from hidden to witnessed. Elias looked at the folder in his jacket, then at the people around the dying heater. "We're not sneaking anybody out the back," he said. Mara understood first. "Elias." He turned toward the door where daylight spilled across the dirty floorboards. "Tonight is Winter Lantern Night," he said. Walter wanted the town looking its best." Jonah gave a tired, humorless smile. "Then I suppose we should attend." Sable moved to the doorway and stood in the bright strip of snowlight, waiting. Elias looked at the people who had been placed at the bottom of someone else's list. "We walk the main road," he said. "Together." They reached Ashen Pike just as the winter light began to soften. The sky above the lake had turned a pale gold, and snow drifted down in pieces so fine they looked weightless. From a distance, the town square glowed with lanterns. Warm bulbs hung from wire lines between storefronts. Paper stars turned slowly in the wind. The big spruce near the center had been wrapped in strings of white lights that made the snow beneath it shine like sugar. It was beautiful. That was the worst part. Elias walked at the front with Sable beside him, his boots breaking a path through the packed snow. Behind him, Mara leaned heavily on her cut-down pole, each step measured and painful. Helen stayed close enough to catch her if she stumbled. Jonah walked with Deputy Colin Arlen on one side and a dock worker named Perry on the other, his breath coming rough but steady. The others followed in a loose line, wrapped in mismatched blankets and coats, not marching, not protesting, simply refusing to remain unseen. No one spoke much. Words would have made it smaller. The square was already crowded with adults from town, shop owners, mill families, church volunteers, mechanics still in work jackets, couples holding paper cups of cocoa, and a few well-dressed visitors Elias did not recognize. A local photographer stood near the spruce adjusting his lens. On a small platform beside the tree, a banner stretched between two poles. Ashen Pike takes care of its own. Walter Keene stood beneath it. He wore a camel-colored wool coat and a burgundy tie, silver hair combed neatly, the snowflake pin on his lapel catching the lantern light. He had one hand resting on the podium and the other ready to lift in greeting, as though kindness itself had been rehearsed into his posture. Dorian Pike stood near the platform with two investors, his smile thin and watchful. Walter saw them before the crowd did. For one brief moment, his expression failed. Not enough for most people to notice, but Elias noticed. The warmth dropped from Walter's eyes, leaving something flat and calculating beneath. Then the smile returned. "My goodness," Walter said, stepping down from the platform, his voice carried with practiced ease. "Mara, we were told there had been an accident." "Thank God you're alive." Mara stopped several feet from him. Her face had gone white again, but this time not from cold. Walter looked past her at Jonah, at the others, at Colin's notebook, visible in the deputy's gloved hand. "This appears to be a misunderstanding," he said gently, turning just enough that the crowd could hear. "A painful one, clearly, but still a misunderstanding." Dorian moved in smoothly. Several individuals were found occupying an unsafe structure inside an active development zone. Ms. Bellamy removed relief supplies without authorization and created a situation that could have endangered everyone involved. A murmur passed through the square. Elias watched the crowd lean, not physically, but morally. People wanted the explanation to be reasonable. Reasonable explanations asked less of them. Mara stepped forward. For a second, Elias thought she might fall. Helen's hand hovered near her elbow, but Mara did not take it. "I signed the transfer confirmation," Mara said. Her voice was not loud. That made people listen harder. Walter's expression softened with something that looked almost like pity. "I trusted the process," Mara continued. "I trusted Walter. I signed because I was told the second group had already been moved to Braddock Falls." Dorian sighed. "Mara, this is not the time." "No," she said, and the word cut cleanly through the square. "This is exactly the time." The wind lifted snow across the lanterns. Mara looked at the people gathered there, not at Walter. Jonah Reed was marked transferred, so were 7 others. They were not transferred. They were left in a storage shed with a dying oil heater while Harbor House sat locked. A woman near the cocoa table lowered her cup. Someone whispered Jonah's name. Walter lifted both hands, palms open. No one was left. Some residents declined transport. Others made private arrangements. The situation has been complicated, and Mara has been under terrible strain. Mara laughed once. It was not bitter this time. It was tired. "You said the same thing in the email." Walter's smile held, but his eyes sharpened. Elias reached inside his jacket and took out Jonah's folder. He did not raise it like a trophy. He simply walked to a folding table near the platform and laid the pages flat beneath the lantern light. "Read them," he said. No one moved at first. And then Ruth Calder came forward. Elias knew her from the diner on Birch Street, a short, sturdy woman with silver-brown hair tucked into a loose bun and flour still dusting one sleeve of her plum-colored sweater. She had a dish towel tucked through the string of her apron as if she had walked out in the middle of closing the kitchen. She looked down at the papers. Her mouth opened slightly. "That's Daniel Mott," she whispered. One of the men from the shed lowered his head. Ruth touched the page with one red-knuckled finger. "He washed dishes for me the winter my fryer broke. Wouldn't take extra pay. Said he liked the heat in the kitchen. No immediate family contact. Transport deferred. Non-essential shelter placement." Ruth's hand began to shake. Walter stepped toward her. "Ruth, those are internal triage documents. They are not meant to be interpreted without context." She looked up at him. "What context makes a man non-essential?" The square went still. That was when Elias felt the shape of the night change. Not into victory. It was too early for that. But something had cracked in the wall Walter had built around himself. Walter sensed it too. He turned to the crowd and his voice deepened, taking on the tone of a man willing to carry a burden others were too sentimental to understand. "Ashen Pike is dying," he said. "We all know it. The mill is gone. Half the storefronts are one bad month from closing. Our young adults leave because there is nothing for them here. The lakefront resort is not greed. It is survival." The investors behind him stood straighter. "Hard decisions had to be made," Walter continued. "Temporary relocation, property assessment, Safety classifications. These are not acts of cruelty. They are the work required to keep a town alive. Jonah coughed, a deep tearing sound that made Helen step closer. Walter glanced at him, then away. Some cases, Walter said, were to be handled later. The phrase moved through Elias like a blade sliding between ribs. Handled later. Not priority. Transport deferred. He could almost smell diesel and snow from another place, another winter, another man waiting beside a road for help that arrived after his breath had stopped making steam. Elias did not answer Walter. He looked at Sable. And the shepherd had been standing beside Mara, the torn orange strip from the relief jacket tied loosely near her collar. Now, she walked into the open space before the banner and sat down. She did not growl. She did not bare her teeth. She simply sat beneath the words, "Ashen Pike takes care of its own," her amber eyes fixed not on Walter alone, but on everyone watching. No one laughed. No one called the dog away. The silence became unbearable because it had a shape now. Jonah stepped forward. Colin moved to support him, but Jonah shook his head. Helen protested under her breath. He ignored her too. Every few steps cost him, yet he kept going until he stood close enough to the table for the lantern light to show the hollows beneath his cheekbones. "I don't want to shame this town," Jonah said. His voice was rough and thin, but it carried. "I don't. I worked here, ate here, buried my wife here. I put my hands on half the buildings you people take pictures in front of." A few faces in the crowd lowered. "I helped raise the dock where folks take wedding photos. I patched the roof of that church after the storm of 2011. I sanded the floorboards in Ruth's diner when she couldn't afford a contractor." Ruth covered her mouth. Jonah looked up at the banner. "So I need somebody to tell me when I stopped being part of our own. Was it when my lungs went bad? When I couldn't lift lumber anymore? When I didn't have family left to call the right people?" His breath caught. Helen reached for him, but he held up one hand. Or was it when somebody decided I made the town look too poor for investors?" No one answered. They could not. Ruth stepped forward first. Her face was wet, and she did not wipe it. "My kitchen opens tonight," she said. "Soup, bread, coffee, whatever Harbor House needs." A man in a wool cap near the hardware store lifted his hand. "I can check the furnace." Another voice came from the back. "I've got a snow hauler. I've got blankets. I've got propane." The words came awkwardly, one at a time, as if people were remembering a language they had not used in years. Then the church doors opened. Reverend Clara Holt came down the steps with a leather-bound record book clutched against her coat. Snow had gathered on her shoulders. Her face looked pale, but not uncertain. "A Harbor House was established under a community trust," she said when she reached the square. "Not private charity, not development property, a trust." Walter's face changed. "Clara." She didn't look at him. "The condition is clear," she said. "The building and land are to serve shelter, relief, or public welfare. If it was declared inactive to transfer control for commercial development, that declaration was false." Dorian took a step forward. "Reverend, I strongly suggest you speak with counsel before making public accusations." Clara turned to the crowd instead. "I was afraid of dividing the town," she said, "so I let people be divided from it." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "I was afraid Harbor House would tear us apart if I questioned Walter, so I said nothing." And while I said nothing, people froze behind pines. Walter stood beneath the lanterns, the snowflake pin bright on his coat, and for the first time that evening he looked alone, but he was not defeated, not yet. He looked at the shop owners, the workers, the worried faces of people who could not afford righteousness if it cost them their livelihoods. "You may stop this project tonight," he said quietly. "You may feel noble doing it, but when the investors leave, when the jobs vanish, when your stores close and your children stop coming home for good, remember this moment. Remember that you chose sentiment over survival." No one spoke. That was the cruelest thing Walter had said all night, because it carried enough truth to wound. And Elias looked around the square and saw the real battle then. It was not Walter against Mara, not Dorian against a folder of documents, not even truth against lies. It was fear against conscience, and fear had always known how to sound practical. Sable remained beneath the banner, still and watchful, the orange strip at her collar moving gently in the wind. Elias looked at the people from the shed, at Mara standing on a wounded leg, at Jonah breathing like every breath had to be negotiated. Then he looked back at the town. No one had been rescued yet. They had only been seen. And sometimes being seen was the first thing power tried to prevent. The meeting moved into the church because no one knew where else to put the truth. Winter Lantern Night had ended without music, without the lighting ceremony, without Walter Keene's speech about generosity and future prosperity. The cocoa table outside sat abandoned beneath a dusting of snow. Lanterns still glowed in the square, but their warmth no longer felt festive. They lit the windows of the church in trembling gold while people filed inside with their coats still wet, their boots leaving dark marks on the wooden floor. No one took the front pews at first. That was where people usually sat when they wanted to be seen supporting something. Tonight, everyone seemed afraid of being seen too clearly. Jonah Reed sat near the aisle with a blanket over his shoulders, breathing shallowly while Dr. Helen Ward checked his pulse with 2 fingers. Mara Bellamy sat behind him, her injured legs stretched carefully into the aisle. Deputy Colin Arlen stood near the back wall with his notebook in both hands, as if the small black cover had become heavier since he began using it properly. Sable lay at Jonah's feet, not guarding, not performing, just staying. Walter Keene remained near the front, beneath the plain wooden cross, his camel coat still buttoned, his silver snowflake pin still bright. He looked less like a man cornered than a man disappointed in people who had failed to understand how much he had done for them. Dorian Pike stood by the side door, phone in hand, speaking low to someone Elias guessed was either a lawyer or a man paid to sound like one. Reverend Clara Holt placed the old leather record book on the communion table. The sound of it touching wood was small, but every head turned. "This is the original Harbor House Trust record," Clara said. Her voice was tired, but it didn't shake. The property was given to the church and town jointly for shelter, relief, and public welfare. It was never meant to become private development land. Walter folded his hands in front of him. "Clara, no one is trying to erase its history." "No," she said, "only its purpose." A few people shifted in the pews. Walter looked out over them, and when he spoke again, the softness returned to his voice. And it was the voice that had raised money after storms, comforted widows, opened winter fundraisers. A voice Ashen Pike had trusted because trusting it made the town feel better about itself. "I didn't steal from anyone," he said. "I reallocated resources to prepare for something larger than one building. Harbor House was always temporary. The resort would bring jobs, tax revenue, repairs to roads we can barely maintain. It would keep this town from becoming another place people drive through and pity." No one answered, because part of them feared he was right. Elias saw it in their faces. Store owners counting unpaid bills, mechanics remembering empty work orders, older couples wondering why their grown sons and daughters only visited on holidays. Walter knew where the fear lived, and he had built his argument there. Elias stood slowly. He didn't move to the pulpit. He did not want it. He stood in the aisle, halfway between Walter and the people in the pews. "I know what it means to choose when there isn't enough," he said. His voice carried because the room had become so quiet. "I've seen lists made in bad weather. Medical first, mobile first, young first, strong first. You tell yourself it's practical. You tell yourself someone has to decide. And maybe sometimes that's true." His hand moved once toward the old watch on his wrist, then stopped. But the danger comes when the list stops being a tool and starts becoming an excuse, when a person becomes a delayed transport, a low priority, a case to handle later. Walter's eyes narrowed. Elias looked at Jonah. If a town has to stop seeing some of its people in order to survive, then maybe survival isn't the same thing as being alive." The words did not strike like a speech. They settled like snow, quiet and difficult to remove. Mara pushed herself upright. Helen turned. "Mara." "I'm sitting," Mara said. "That counts as medical cooperation." A tired laugh moved through one corner of the room, then faded. Mara held the cracked document pouch in her lap. "My signature is on one of those papers. I can say Walter lied to me, and he did. I can say I was tired, and I was, but I signed it because it was easier to trust a good man's reputation than to check whether the people on the list were actually safe. She looked toward the people from the shed. "I'm sorry," she said. Not because I got caught, because you waited for someone to come back, and I was part of why no one came sooner." Jonah did not speak, but after a moment, he nodded once. That small nod did what forgiveness could not yet do. It allowed the room to keep breathing. Helen stood next. "I examined Mr. Reed and the others," she said. "Cold exposure, respiratory distress, inadequate heat. One more night in that shed could have killed someone, maybe more than one." Walter's jaw tightened. "That is speculation." Helen looked at him as if he had become a symptom. "No, that is medicine." Colin cleared his throat from the back. Every face turned toward him, and he looked for a moment like he wished he could disappear into the coat rack. "I took statements at the shed," he said. "Names, conditions. Time spent there. I'll file the report with the county tonight." Dorian turned sharply. "Deputy, I strongly recommend you wait until council reviews." Colin closed his notebook. The sound was final enough. "I already waited too long." That was the moment the meeting changed, not because Walter lost power all at once. Power like his did not vanish that cleanly. It changed because the people who had been borrowing his certainty began reaching for their own. Clara placed both hands on the trust record. "The church will petition for an emergency injunction to stop any transfer of Harbor House property," she said. "We will request an audit of the Winter Relief Fund, and tonight we reopen Harbor House." Walter's face flushed. "On whose authority?" Clara lifted her eyes to his. "No, the authority we should have used before." For the first time, Walter's control broke. "You're all very grateful when someone else carries the burden," he said, voice rising. "You clap when the checks clear. You smile when I bring in donors. You ask me to save this town, then curse me when saving it requires decisions your soft hearts cannot make." Ruth Calder stood from the third pew. She untied the apron from around her waist and laid it across the pew like she was putting down an old excuse. "My kitchen opens tonight," she said. "Soup, bread, coffee, for Harbor House, every night this week." A man near the window lifted a hand. "I can look at the furnace." "I've got 2 space heaters," someone else said. "My snow hauler can move beds." "I can check the accounts," said an older woman with square glasses. "I did books for the mill for 30 years. The offers did not come like thunder. They came unevenly, awkwardly, from people embarrassed by how long it had taken them to speak. But each one made the room warmer. Dorian left through the side door, phone already at his ear, his polished boot slipping slightly on the icy step outside. Walter stayed a little longer. He looked at the people who had once needed his permission to feel generous. Now they were turning toward one another without him, and that wounded him more visibly than any accusation. No one arrested him, no one dragged him out. He simply became smaller in a room where his goodness no longer belonged to him. And by midnight, Harbor House had light again. Not enough, not perfect. The furnace coughed and rattled when the electrician coaxed it back to life. 2 beds had broken frames. The pantry shelves were half empty. The front door stuck until Perry planed the swollen edge with a borrowed tool. The legal fight would come later. The audit would come later. Walter's consequences would come later, if they came at all. But the door opened. Ruth's soup steamed from dented pots. Helen checked blood pressure, lungs, fingers, toes. Clara sat at a folding table, writing names by hand into a new list and asking each person where they wanted emergency contact information kept. Colin stood outside with his coat collar up, making calls to county dispatch that he should have made days earlier. Amara sat beside the table, leg-wrapped, face pale, copying names from the old records into the new ones. Her hand shook. She kept writing anyway. Jonah took a chair near the furnace. Sable lay down beneath it, her body stretched across his boots as if to pin him gently to the warmth. He rested one work-worn hand on her head. "That dog didn't find Harbor House," Jonah said to Elias. "She found what we hid from ourselves." Elias had no answer for that. He stepped onto the porch. Snow fell through the yellow light above the door. Across the road, Ashen Pike looked almost the same as it had that morning. White roofs, dark pines, frozen lake beyond. Still beautiful, still capable of lying if seen from far enough away. Sable came out and leaned against his leg. And Elias lowered his hand to her neck, fingers brushing the scratched tag. Stay. I thought you were leading me to someone lost, he said quietly. Inside, voices moved around bowls of soup and blankets and names written correctly for the first time in too long. Elias looked through the open door. No, he whispered. You were leading me back to the part of me that still knew how to stay. By morning, the snow had covered the old tracks to the shed, but the path to Harbor House was full of footprints, not from people running away, from people coming back. Sometimes the miracle is not a door opening by itself. Sometimes it is one person deciding not to look away. Harbor House was saved because people finally remembered that a town is not measured by its lights, its buildings, or its promises, but by how it treats the ones who have been pushed out of sight. May we all have the courage to notice who is missing, the humility to admit when we stayed silent too long, and the grace to come back before it is too late. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories about loyalty, courage, and the quiet ways hope finds us, please subscribe and stay with us for the next one. May God give you peace, and may He help you become someone's open door when they need it most.